Curious if you're familiar with the Minnesota School of Business and Global University.
I'm not familiar with that specific school.
Okay. Do you know that they were found to be engaged in consumer fraud?
If they were, I'm assuming there are some borrower defense claims pending for them.
Okay. So let me just enlighten you. We've sent you many letters from our delegation. In my district in 2016, the courts found that Minnesota School of Business and Global University engaged in consumer fraud and purposefully deceived their students by misrepresenting the job opportunities that would be available to their criminal justice graduates. Madam Secretary, that same year, your department independently reviewed the evidence and came to the same conclusion as the courts. The students were blatantly misled and taken advantage of. 1,336 Minnesota students were systematically misled to believe that they will obtain a degree and credits that were essentially meaningless, losing not only $33.8 million, but their time and countless opportunities. Let's take a minute to just imagine if these weren't just students. Let's imagine that they were corporations. The administration and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and probably you, would be up in arms. Corporate executives would not only get their debt forgiven by our government, they would also get compensation for their lost time, lost opportunities, and psychological distress. But Madam Secretary, you don't seem to be up in arms. Nobody seems to be concerned with what's happening with these students. Students who do not have access to corporate attorneys to make their case. Instead, they are struggling to make ends meet as they continue to face accruing interest, negative credit reporting, and the inability to restart their education, all the while hoping the government will do the right thing. I'd like to request unanimous consent to enter into the record 2 affidavits.
Objection.
These are from my constituents Whitney and Cheryl Stellan, whose borrower defense applications have been on hold since January of this year. Between the 2 of them, they have approximately $78,000 in crippling student debt. To make matters worse, once a borrower defaults, the consequences are severe and results in a snowball effect where a borrower might lose their eligibility to receive additional federal student aid and see devastating effects to their credit. Memo after memo, the Education Department career staff sent you memos that indicate that these students deserve nothing less than full relief. I know that you've said you haven't read these memos yet, but reports have come out, and I would have expected that you would take the time to read them before appearing before us today. I ask for unanimous consent to enter these 3 memos into the record.
Without objection.
I feel like you should be ashamed of the fact that you don't have answers to these memos, that you haven't looked at these memos, that you haven't taken the responsibility that you have as a leader to be prepared to give us a response. And I think the public should be ashamed that they have a Secretary of Education that's not putting the interests of students before the interests of the wealthy that are benefiting from defrauding these students. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, if I may respond.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. Secretary can respond.
Congresswoman, with all due respect, I am very much focused on doing what's right for these students. And the memos to which you're referring preceded me, and they may have been relevant to conversation about how we proceeded with policy, but administrations changed and policies change.
They are precisely relevant to the conversation you were preparing to come to talk to us today. And in your preparation, you should have read those memos. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. First, a lot has been said about whether or not this applies to for-profits.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Madam Secretary. With all due respect to my colleague from Louisiana, education is not mayonnaise, and frankly, the day that we start treating the education of our children like we do the marketing of a condiment is the day that we've given up on our kids, and that's at the foundation of my worry about some of the proposals that you've put forth in your budget. K-12 is a for-profit operator. It was a for-profit operator, one of the biggest in the country. Your family was invested in it. And a New York Times article on this organization said that a portrait emerges of this company as trying to squeeze profits from public school dollars by raising enrollment, increasing teacher workload, and lowering standards. As a researcher at the University of Colorado said, the people that are running these for-profit companies are fundamentally trying to do to public education what the banks did with home mortgages. Now, you and I have a fundamental disagreement. I just don't think that there's any room in our public education for individuals making millions of dollars, making their fortune off of taxpayer dollars. But to the extent that you want to move more public dollars into the private sector, some of it will end up in the hands of these for-profit charter school operators. And so my question is, does your proposal require any of these companies to disclose their profits? Will it cap the salaries of these CEOs? What protections will be in your, specific protections will be in your proposal, in your program to make sure that taxpayer dollars don't just end up enriching the pockets of the folks that own these companies?
Senator, thanks for that question. I think your question more broadly is better framed around what are students achieving, and I think the question is not what the tax status is.
Well, that's not, that wasn't my question.
I don't think the question is the tax status of a school. The question is not the tax, in my view, it's not the tax status of the school, it's what are students achieving.
You can have any view of my question as you want, but my question is what protections will be on taxpayer dollars to make sure that the heads of these companies don't end up becoming millionaires or billionaires off of the operation of these schools?
If parents are making choices, regardless of the tax status of the school to which they're sending them, whether it's a for-profit managed institution or a not-for-profit, if students are achieving and parents are making those choices on behalf of their children, I think those are the better measures to be oriented around.
I understand. Your question is there will be no protections for taxpayer dollars. I understand that you have a belief in the market that will end up solving the problems that may encounter. But here's my worry. You spent some time today talking about students in East Hartford, Connecticut. And I fundamentally don't believe that this administration cares about the outcomes of students at East Hartford High School, because if you did, you wouldn't be proposing these massive cuts in the programs that help the kids of East Hartford High School. Talking about massive cuts for after-school programs that help kids in places like East Hartford. You're talking about massive cuts in career and technical education. You're talking about eliminating support for teacher training. All you're giving is the opportunity to choose a different school. But the fact of the matter is that's not a panacea. Right? In Michigan alone, right, 70% of the charters in Detroit ranked in the bottom 25% of the state's schools. And you can't just chalk that up to the difficulty of educating kids in Detroit, because the majority of African-American kids that were attending charter districts statewide performed worse than many of the students in those city schools. So ultimately, to me, this can't be about the kids in East Hartford, because if it was, you wouldn't be taking all this funding away from them, and you wouldn't just be throwing them out into a market-driven system that seems mostly about enriching the salaries of the CEOs who run these companies. This seems about a massive transfer of money from the public sector to the private sector with no protections around it. So I would hope that in devising this proposal, you will go back and think about making sure that kids get protected, right, whether they're in a public school or a private school, and that our taxpayer dollars don't end up simply being transferred to pad the pockets of the folks that are operating these schools. I understand